For all the talk about an oligarchy running America, there's hardly a damn thing known about how it actually operates. It's not like you can open a civics textbook and see the chain of command. What you get instead are sermons about how the corporate elite or the New World Order is running things through the corpse of democracy. That all may be true, but it's about as actionable as a nursery rhyme. What you don't see is hard evidence that cabinet members carried out treasonous orders from overseas to help a criminal cartel wage an all-out war on Americans. But every once in a while, yeah.
Welcome to Shadow of Truth, and today is Monday, April the 24th, 2017, and your hosts are Dave Kranzler from InvestmentResearchDynamics.com and Rory Hall from thedailycoin.org, and we have a very special guest today, Mr. John Titus of Best Evidence.
I'm good, Rory. Thanks for having me back on.
Dave, how you doing?
Oh, did you asked how I'm doing?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm doing okay. It's good to be back to work after a somewhat uneventful weekend, but I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit about Mr. Titus's latest project, All the Plenary's Men, because I don't think there's anyone in the podcast world that's doing better, more well-researched work and higher quality films and videos than John.
Well, certainly after this one, there's no one doing any more shocking work. This one is a shocker.
They've all been pretty shocking, so I guess I better get a cup of coffee before I hear how shocking this one is.
Well, John, we're glad you're here, and we'll just jump right in. And what's the subject, John?
Well, in July of 2016, the House, the Financial Services Committee, the Republicans on the Financial Services Committee, put out a report about HSBC and why they didn't prosecute either the bank or anyone at the bank for admitted money laundering on behalf of terrorists and drug dealers. And the report is really they're really going after it's Republicans from the Financial Services Committee, and they want to go after Eric Holder for not being candid with Congress about why there were no prosecutions. But it's really weak on that score, because all Holder said to Congress was no bank is too big. Of course he says that. No bank is too big. No one in the US is too big to prosecute. Well, that's a bunch of nonsense, and they know it, but it's a very, very hard thing to prove. What's interesting about the report is that it includes some exhibits that enable us to figure out why the DOJ didn't prosecute HSBC and why the DOJ hasn't prosecuted any too big to fail bank. And that's really the story in there, but it's a really there's a lot of detail in this one, and a lot of legalities in this one, and it's just taking me time to unpack everything in that report and lay it all out so it's crystal clear what's going on. And I'll tell you why this issue is so important. And it took me a long time to come to this. That's one of the reasons I like working on these films is, I take a long time with them, and I think about stuff more and more and more. But if you think about sovereign powers, sovereign powers being things like the power to tax, the power to pass law, the power to make arrests, the power to print money, things that the government can do that people can't do, those are sovereign powers, right? If I came to you and I said, I'll give you a choice about which power you can have. You can either have the power to print money, or you can have the power to commit crimes without any consequences at all. Which of those two would you take? Well, the answer is you'd take the power to commit crime, because that subsumes the power to print money, right? If you can commit crime with impunity, you can counterfeit without any consequences at all.
Yep.
So the ultimate power is the power to commit crimes with impunity, and that power is captured by William Blackstone from the 1700s in England, who very succinctly captured the power of a king. He said the king can do no wrong, and that is the ultimate sovereign power. So we don't have that in the U.S., right? We know from the Nixon episode that the president is not above the law himself, that the president, while the king may not be able to do any wrong, the president most certainly can do wrong, and he can be held accountable. So if there is an entity in the U.S. that has the power to commit crime with impunity, then really that entity is the sovereign power of the country. It's not the president, it's not Congress, it's not the courts, because they don't have unlimited powers. Do you follow me?
Yep.
And that is why this issue is so important, because if there is a group or an entity that has unlimited power to commit crime with impunity, then that's really your sovereign power in the country. And that's what this whole thing really boils down to. And I get at that at the end. Fortunately, the way I make my films is I do them more or less linearly. You know, a lot of times if you watch movies, you'll find out after you see the movie, oh, they shot the end scenes first, and then they went back and they shot the beginning scenes at the very end. They mixed it up. But I don't do that. I work more or less in a straight line. And so as the film moves along, you know, my thinking is moving along too. So I really get to the ultimate point at the very end of the film, which is the real sovereign power in the U.S. ain't the president. And that really, I think, explains a lot of what has been going on recently, where all of a sudden candidate Trump is dead, and we now have politician Trump in his place, and it's a totally different guy. Apparently, President Trump has gotten the memo from the real sovereign power in the U.S., and it ain't him.
Well, that's what I said a few weeks ago, or a couple of weeks ago, whenever he started showing his real colors, that apparently they had the same conversation with Trump that Victoria Nuland had with Prime Minister Tsipras of Greece, that either you get with the program or things are your family, your life, everything is going to change, and you're not going to like the change at all.
Right. Get on board or get gone. Those
exactly.
are your two choices. And it really doesn't matter whether Trump intended all of this from the very beginning. What really matters to us on a day-to-day basis in terms of governance is that you're not going to get somebody in the Oval Office or anywhere else in any position of appreciable power who's going to act in your interests. You're going to get somebody in power. The only people who are going to achieve power in this country are people who are doing the bidding of the real sovereign power of the U.S.,
which are the bankers.
Is the criminal banking cartel. And I lay that out in meticulous detail. In fact, I have a warning at the beginning of the video to say we're going to cover some material here. So if you're used to mainstream media, you know, you've been warned.
That's awesome. Let me ask you something here, John. I agree that the banks are they're free to commit crimes without any fear of getting the rule of law enforced on them. But I don't think it's just the banks. I define the entity, the sovereign entity, as the deep state, and of which the banks are just part of.
I agree with that. You know, but basically, you know, the king. Let's go back to Blackstone. The king can do no wrong. You know, I don't know who the king is. I don't purport to know who the king is, but I can identify as men rather easily when I see them committing crimes with no consequence. So I would classify the banks as the king's men without ever needing to say they're the only ones of the king's men. There are others too, for sure. And I think your classification of the whole entity as the deep state is a good one.
I mean, for me, the biggest signal that the deep state was getting ready to take over the White House was when Trump appointed Tillerson as Secretary of State, you know, the CEO of Exxon. and Exxon, big oil is part of the deep state, and Exxon is, one of 3 or 4 of the kingpins of big oil. And when he came out and said, "Well, I'm not, I've distanced myself, I've recused myself from Exxon activities," and I was like, "Yeah, right."
Right.
That tells us this guy's a great liar.
Just like
this guy tells us he's in there on behalf of big oil. Right. And that's, this idea that Trump was going to try and make nice with Russia and figure out a cooperative solution to what's going on in Syria, even though there really isn't anything going on. Everything that's going on was created by the U.S. government and the military complex. But I knew, the U.S., Obama tried to get Assad out of there twice and failed. I knew the Trump government was going to make a run at it as soon as I saw he appointed Tillerson. Because Exxon is a partner in a limited partnership that's trying to run a gas pipeline from Qatar through Syria and into Turkey and then into Southern Europe. Right. And I mean, it's just when you put all the pieces together, it's just so obvious what's going on. These guys don't even really try to hide it anymore.
Well, why should they? I mean, they have complete immunity.
Right. That's a correct statement. The other thing is you say Tillerson was a tell. Another tell was all the Goldman Sachs appointments.
Yeah.
Right.
The Treasury Secretary Mnuchin is from Goldman Sachs. Gary Cohn, was the COO of Goldman Sachs. Every time you turn around, the woman who took over from Steve Bannon was from Goldman Sachs. They're all, that to me is the tell. Because while we may not know who the ultimate sovereign power is, remember, there can't be 2 kings in a kingdom. There's one. So we may not know who the ultimate power is. I don't think at this point there's any dispute that Goldman is running the show when it comes to the banks.
You think they're sitting at the top, even though you've got HSBC and JP Morgan committing these massive crimes that are both been indicted in the LIBOR, Forex, drug money laundering, funding terrorists, all of these things. Both of those have been.
Well, that's a good point, Rory. That's the difference between Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and HSBC. JP Morgan and HSBC are getting indicted. Goldman's skating away with everything.
Right. Goldman was never implicated in any of the mortgage-backed. I mean, they were because people knew about it, and the Justice Department had to address it due to the Carl Levin hearing. You remember that famous hearing? Do you tell your clients you're selling them shitty deals when you make the deals? They repeated that, countless times in the media. So the DOJ had to address it. But you're right in that Goldman never signed a deferred prosecution agreement. They simply weren't charged at all. The others, and there's other information too, and I lay this out in the film, that you'll see that Goldman is the ringleader. There is no doubt about that. But they're not alone. Certainly they have their other banks around, JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citigroup. I mean, there's a bunch of them. But Goldman's the ringleader. No doubt about that.
I'm really interested if you have been able to uncover anything in regards to the drug money coming out of Afghanistan with the heroin trade, and where that money's going. Have you been able to piece any of that together at this time?
HSBC was implicated for laundering money on behalf of drug dealers. They admitted that flat out.
Yes.
So there's no dispute about that whatsoever. They committed crimes. HSBC committed money laundering crimes for drug dealers. So what does it mean in terms of the fact that no one at HSBC was prosecuted individually, and the bank itself was not prosecuted as a corporate entity? They signed a deferred prosecution agreement. They paid a so-called $1.92 billion fine. I showed that it's not really a fine, that they actually set that amount themselves. But what that means ultimately is that laundering money for drug dealers is official bank business.
Yes.
That's why no one was prosecuted. So you gotta let that one sink in for a few minutes. The crimes, I get around to this in the film, the crimes that aren't prosecuted are official bank business. And that's a heavy duty statement, but you got to chew on it for a while. It's not like bankers don't ever get prosecuted. They do. But the ones who are in the big banks, and the real bad guy here, by the way, isn't so much the Federal Reserve, it's the Federal Reserve's daddy, the Bank for International Settlements, who's the real ringleader. The bankers who get prosecuted, who come from those bigger banks, if you look at all those prosecutions, they're acting for themselves rather than the bank, right? So insider trading, yeah, you can go to jail for insider trading because you're trying to enrich yourself. But if you're doing the bank's business, you walk on water. You got it?
Yep.
I mean, look at the prosecution of Rajat Gupta of Goldman Sachs. This guy, he was a board member of Goldman Sachs. He's in prison. Why? Because he passed along confidential boardroom information from inside Goldman to outside Goldman, and that's a big no-no because these banks protect their information. I mean, they guard it like they actually guard it better than Fort Knox because Fort Knox is probably empty. They don't release their information. That's why Hillary never produced those transcripts. They weren't hers to begin with. That was Goldman saying, no, we don't disclose our information. So when Rajat Gupta took that confidential boardroom information from inside Goldman and passed it along to Raj Rajaratnam, that was it. His immunity went bye-bye. Now he's in prison.
Because you can't hide the crime if you let any piece of information out. There can't be any disclosures on any level of any kind. Otherwise, the whole scheme comes crashing down.
Now you got to be a team member, and if you act on your own and you're helping yourself rather than the bank, it's open season on you. Sorry. The other big thing is, think about Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo opened millions of accounts in people's names. How is that not identity theft? How is that not millions of accounts of identity theft? Well, the answer is it is, but it's official bank business to go ahead and open accounts in people's names without them knowing about it. One of the things I came across that was interesting while making this film was there's an interview with John Cruz, who's a whistleblower from HSBC. He was a vice president at the bank for 2 years between 2008 and 2010. He saw what was going on. And I don't include this in the film, although I may circle back around to it in the future. In fact, I'm pretty sure I will. But he said something, I'm like, what? HSBC did the same thing as Wells Fargo. They opened accounts in people's names. People didn't know about it. They pumped hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars through the account. And then they closed the accounts. And the people in whose names the accounts were opened were never the wiser. They never knew, hey, I had an account. Who knows? I had an account and $10 million went through it and then it closed. But what Cruz said that really grabbed my attention is he said, when HSBC closed those accounts, let's say they opened the account on December 1st, 2016, and they leave it open for a year, and they come around this year and they're going to close the account. He said what they do is they close the account and they log in that they've closed the account the day after they open the account. HSBC will open an account in a customer's name. Let's say they open the account tomorrow. Okay. What they do when they close the account is they said, we closed it today, which is impossible. It's impossible
Right.
to open the account in the future and close the account in the past. He said the reason the HSBC did that was so that there's no audit trail of that account. The computers can't assimilate that information. And they're just like, well, that's not an account. And I thought about that. I'm like, that's a really startling thing. That's right there tells you why digital money is so dangerous. I mean, think about it. If you have money in a bank account and that account gets closed, if something goes wrong, at least you've got a claim against the bank, right? They've got a record of it. But if they close it before, not only is your money gone, so is your legal claim.
It doesn't exist.
The only thing you've got left is maybe computer records and maybe written statements. But by and large, that account's gone, never existed. It's been expunged.
Well, you'll have a paper statement, though.
You'd have a paper statement. That's what I'm saying. You'd have, but as far as the bank's concerned, and keep in mind, and I show this in the video, when the DOJ investigates these banks, they don't investigate the bank at all. They turn over the audit of the bank to the bank, and they go ahead and investigate yourselves. That's how that works. The DOJ isn't investigating any of these guys. We've known about this for 4 years. Martin Smith disclosed that, revealed it in The Untouchables in January of 2013. He said, we talk to people inside the Justice Department, and they tell us there's no subpoenas, there's no document reviews, there's no wiretaps. There's not even one case even close to indicting Wall Street for financial crime. And Lanny Brewer, who was the head of the criminal division back then, doesn't deny it.
Isn't that the guy that's in Lanny Brewer? Isn't he the one that came out and said, we won't prosecute these people? We won't prosecute any banker?
He didn't come out and say that. What he came out and said in a New York City bar speech was that, I'm in my conference room in the DOJ all the time. We have banks in there all the time telling us about the bad collateral consequences of the prosecution. And a lot of times those arguments are very persuasive, which is like, well, how is that not sovereign immunity? How is that not criminal sovereign immunity? In other words, the wrongdoer is coming in and telling you, don't prosecute me, and you listen. It's crazy.
Essentially what the banks are coming in and saying is, look, we're going to break the law and we're going to steal money from anything that we can steal money from. But if you prosecute us, the markets are going to collapse.
Well, that's a threat.
So essentially, they gave themselves a license to commit crimes. Again, it gets back to the ultimate power is the power to commit crime with impunity. And Lanny Brewer affirmed that.
And they went along with it, right?
Right.
So there's your sovereign power right there. You don't even need to go. You can end the conversation right there. The banks run the show. Everybody in government is secondary and basically an agent of the real sovereign, who's the criminal banks.
And let's point out here that for all the Democrats and Obama lovers, that Lanny Brewer was de facto an agent of the Obama government.
True. And so is Eric Holder and so is Loretta Lynch. But if you think for a minute that Jeff Sessions is going to do anything different, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell.
No, of course he's not.
Yeah.
They'll do what the Obama government did after the Bush government. They took everything one step further. And this particular government will take everything that Bush and Obama did and take it another step further.
And that's the nature of the system, which is expansive debt. It's a debt that expands by the power of compounding interest. So whatever problems you have now are guaranteed to get worse when your money is debt.
Which brings me back to the same question. Why does Russia and China and the other countries, the other creditor nations, put up with this? And why would they ever allow, if we can see it, if you can see it, John, and you've investigated it, I would like to think that someone as large as Russia, someone as large as China would look at it and go, this is not right. And
I don't know. I could think of a couple reasons off the top of my head. One was that maybe they're not looking at it. The second is they are looking at it, and it's simply not in their interest to pull the plug all at once.
Well, I'm going to send this video to President Xi Jinping, right to his staff.
Yeah, good luck.
Well,
I mean, what mystifies me is why we're provoking Russia like we are. You want a ground war with Russia? Really? How'd that work out? How'd that work out for Hitler? As I recall, millions of soldiers froze to death. That's not a country you want to toy with. And I mean, I get it. Losing wars makes a lot of money. That's a big moneymaker for the military-industrial complex is losing wars. Just put a bunch of guys in the meat grinder and jack up your profits. That's great. It's a great business model. But the problem with Russia is that's a headline fight.
Yes.
Everybody's going to watch that one. And if you go down in that one, and I got a good sense of how that one would work out, That's a bell ringer.
Well, we already know that we can't. The United States military cannot beat the Russian military.
You
It's
can't
already
beat the
been proven.
Taliban.
Right.
You can't beat the Taliban after how
Bunch
many
of cave
years?
dwellers.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get guys in caves. Something's wrong with that. Something's
Well, I'm
wrong.
not sure that we have a rank and file military that's motivated to do it. They're motivated to get their paycheck and get out in 20 years with a pension. You know, the guys they're fighting are fighting for their lives and their independence. But I don't know that these wars are meant to be won. I think they're just perpetual wars.
No, that's what I'm saying. Losing wars is a big moneymaker.
Right.
Keep going on forever, and eventually you leave or declare victory and leave, whatever you leave. But in the meantime, how long were we supposed to be in Afghanistan and Iraq? Weren't those supposed to be like 3-6 week affairs? We're talking about decades now. They've gone on. They're big moneymakers.
More than a decade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big moneymakers.
And they've started wars on several other fronts.
Might as well.
Right. We're everywhere.
John, do you want to try and give the listeners a real sort of good summary of your film and, sort of the salient points? Because I kind of feel like we've kind of talked around it.
Yeah. Okay. Let me, I'll get at it a couple ways. One is that I don't think, most people who are paying attention now know that you have a two-tiered system of justice. So that there is no rule of law, and that the laws on the books apply to 99.9% of the population, but they don't apply to the corporate elite that's running everything. I think, so that has been established before, and that is in large part what I talked about in the last one, which was, I called it the veneer of justice in the kingdom of crime, which the veneer being this ludicrous pretense that this collateral consequences doctrine is somehow law, and we're pretending that that's why we're not prosecuting the banks. That actually has nothing to do with it. That whole story is just preposterous. We now come to the question of, okay, if it is a two-tiered system of justice, what does the second tier look like? It's not like the corporate elite is allowing things to occur at random. They are most decidedly governed by a system of rules. They have to have a system of rules in place. They're not having cage matches between Tillerson and Lloyd Blankfein to find out who the boss is. That's not going on. So what does the second tier of justice look like? And I get into that, and I show that the dispositions of these cases against the too big to fail banks are in fact governed by a set of rules that just happens to not be in the United States. The rules come from the Bank for International Settlements. They make their own rules, and I will go through the rules and show this is how the bank's cases are being disposed of. Forget collateral consequences. That's a story for the rubes. And collateral consequences being, if you prosecute us, the sky will fall. It's a Chicken Little story. Only an idiot would believe it, really. But there is, in fact, a second set of rules that applies uniquely to the banks. They don't apply to you, and that the banks are indeed above the U.S. legal system, and that their own private legal system trumps it. It's a trump card. Their own private legal system trumps the United States legal system every time there's a case against the banks. There are no exceptions, and that's a kind of a shocking thing, because it gets back to sovereignty. The Justice Department is part of the executive branch. The Attorney General is a cabinet level position. His boss is the United States President. The President and the Department of Justice aren't allowed to prosecute banks because there is, in fact, a superior legal system in place. Then that draws into the question of the United States sovereignty. Is it really a sovereign country? I mean, that's where this is going. I don't really get into that. I get into it at the very end, but that's probably why this film will end up being the second leg of a trilogy. It takes me time to kind of process through and think about what has happened. One of the reasons I wanted to do films rather than say videos, a lot of videos, is that I think a lot's been lost in what I call the Twitterization of the universe. You have this great hive of people flitting from issue to issue to issue, and no one's really contemplating the implications of what we've seen before. And that's a big problem. I mean, the Pentagon Papers came out way back in the day, and it was 5 months before Hannah Arendt wrote, the most persuasive take on the Pentagon Papers. Now, that's unheard of these days because everybody's moving from issue to issue to issue, and no one's taking a step back and think. And that's what I do here with these films is let's look at these issues, number one. And number two, when new information comes to light, like the House Financial Services Committee report, which came out in July of last year and had new information that nobody had seen before, and all of that information bears on what took place in 2012, you now have to take a step back and look at it and say, wait a minute, you told me one thing back in 2012, and now we learn about this. What does this mean? How could this have happened? And I don't really see too many people doing that. Do you follow me?
Yes.
I'll give you an example. And this is an example more or less in real time at the time. In March of 2013, so shortly after the HSBC case settled, the Treasury goes in front of the Senate and says, the Justice Department came to us and asked us for an assessment of the economic impact of prosecuting HSBC, but we never provided one because we're not in a position to guess at what the implications of a prosecution of a bank are. So we told the DOJ we wouldn't prosecute, we wouldn't try to assess the collateral consequences of the prosecution. That testimony is crystal clear. Now, flash forward, so no assessment, right? Even though the DOJ was saying, well, we reach out to regulators, and these regulators are telling us we can't prosecute the big banks, so it's a big hot potato, right? He said, no one's owning up to where do these collateral consequences assessment come from? Well, a year after that, after the Treasury says we never provided an assessment to the DOJ, Jesse Eisinger, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, writes an article for the New York Times book review of the New York Times Magazine. And he says, well, a high-ranking Treasury official did, in fact, tell the Justice Department, told Lanny Brewer, that prosecuting HSBC would have an adverse effect on the financial system. Well, those two things are now diametrically opposed because the Treasury just got finished saying that they never provided an assessment. And then a year later, we find out that a top Treasury official came to the DOJ and said, yes, you can't prosecute HSBC because the sky will fall. So, and no one is, as far as I can tell, and looking at the record, no one has ever tried to reconcile those two diametrically opposed statements. One was under oath and one was appeared in an article, but they're diametrically opposed. I mean, they're, somebody's lying, right? And that's the kind of thing I do in these films is address things that, the Twitterization doesn't address because people are too busy running from issue to issue to issue, and they buzz around one issue and then they move off to the other issue, and there's no institutional memory of what's going on here. And I'll tell you something, a lot's been going on since 2007. Huge things have happened since 2007.
Well, we've lost everything.
And, yeah.
Seriously, we've lost everything.
We're swirling down the toilet.
Yes.
And no one's, I don't think enough people are looking at, they're trying to identify patterns of what's happening in the sweep of these events. And that's one of the things I try to do is look at the events, not flitting from event to event to event, but looking at the whole horse race through a telescope, right? And trying to identify patterns. And that's one of the advantages. One of the reasons I like doing these things. It makes me think.
It's interesting that you named the BIS, the Bank for International Settlement, as the kingpin of this entire operation. This global banking cartel cabal is headed by the Bank of International Settlements. And what I find most interesting about that is that since the inception of that institution, that criminal mafia-style institution, they have a meeting I believe it's every 2 weeks. It's at least once a month.
Right there. Yeah.
There's in attendance, there's fewer than 50 people. And I wrote
Yeah.
an article about these meetings called Tower of Greed. And it shows very clearly that these fewer than 50 people run the entire global economy while they're scraping their part right off the top. I mean, think about that for a minute. Fewer than 50 people. I think it's about 43 people that are listed. But
yeah,
I mean,
I'm shocked.
It's amazing.
It is. And they have these meetings in total secrecy.
In total secrecy.
There's no minutes kept. There's no transcript of these meetings.
Nope.
But yet the big wigs are all going there. You don't think Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen go to those meetings?
They are. It's all the central bank heads, like Bernanke, like Janet Yellen, Draghi, the scumbag out of Japan, whatever. All of these, and it's those folks plus one other of their assistants be able to help them to keep their program together.
Right, and that's a real problem. That's a real problem when you have representatives from a Republican form of government or a Democratic form of government. Certainly, representatives. When you have agents of a representative government going to a meeting to discuss business, and that meeting is conducted in complete secrecy, you've got a real problem on your hands. You don't know what they're doing in that meeting. You don't know what kind of agenda they're coming back and trying to impose in the U.S. I think it's just outrageous that they're even allowed to attend those meetings.
It's incredible. And the thing is that they're constant. They constantly happen.
This is not Ben Bernanke going to a PTA meeting. This guy is going to these meetings in his capacity, or now in Janet Yellen's capacity, as head of the Federal Reserve, the very entity that prints your money, right? And they're discussing business. They're not talking about their kids' soccer game. They're talking about what to do about the global economy.
Right.
And yet these meetings are going on in total secrecy. And you turn around and tell me that this is a representative government? That's just a crock.
Well,
why do they have to do anything about the global economy? Janet Yellen keeps coming out every week telling us things are cool. Things are good, man. Tight labor market, moderate growth. So good, in fact, we're thinking about continuing raising rates and shrinking our balance sheet, both of which will probably not happen.
I mean, the problem with these secret meetings, you don't know who's really running the meeting.
Right.
You can't, it's not like you can look at the minutes and go, okay, well, the head of the meeting is run by this. You wouldn't know if Satan himself were at that meeting, presiding over the thing and conducting the proceedings and beating people for getting out of line. You would have no way of knowing that. There is no transparency into what is going on in Basel, what's going on in the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of all central banks. So this pretense that, it's all democratically done and it's all transparent is just ludicrous. And the Fed itself is bad enough. I mean, you guys both know that, they released the minutes of their meeting more or less contemporaneously, but it takes 5 years for you guys to release a transcript? Unbelievable. And yet we're like, well, having Congress delegate the power to print money to the Federal Reserve, that's the same as Congress doing it itself. Well, then why the secrecy? Why the 5-year delay on the transcripts? What's the holdup? And moreover, when they do release the transcripts, I've read a lot of transcripts, okay? Real transcripts have dashes, ellipses all over the place in the thing. These transcripts read like novels. There's not an comma out of place in these transcripts. They're totally sanitized. I don't know what the real transcripts look like, but they're not that. So that basis alone, I mean, even with a 5-year delay, they're providing you completely sanitized, scrubbed transcripts. And yet there's still, there's shocking stuff in those transcripts.
Making the history that they want you to have.
Yeah, but the question, and then you have something. Who was the guy who recently got kicked out of the Fed or left in disgrace? Was it Jeffrey Lacker? because he had leaked inside information.
Yeah, it was Lacker.
The Fed, and he was a pretty good guy. I got to say, having read a lot of Fed transcripts, Lacker was one of the good guys. Admittedly, in a weak field, he was one of the better ones. And yet he's out now. It just makes me scratch my head about what's going on there.
Well, actually, as you say, he comes across as one of the quote unquote good guys, and yet he's behind the scenes breaking the law.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
You got the criminals running the asylum there.
Lacker was one of the guys who early on in quantitative easing is like, why are we buying these assets? The reasons you're telling me we're buying these assets from the big banks at inflated prices they don't make any sense. Number one, and number two, you guys don't have any plan for unwinding these assets. You never had a plan. So Lacker, at least in the meetings back in 2009, was raising. He was getting at without really nailing down the important issues, and he's gone. The other people are just like like that guy in New York, the New York Fed guy, Bill Dudley. He's just, we're going to buy the assets. Period. Get used to it. That was his.
Well, and he's a former Goldman Sachs partner. So
yeah, exactly.
Again, it's all roads lead back to Goldman Sachs, at least when it comes to the banking part of the deep state.
I tell you another thing that another reason I like doing films, and I've really sort of adopted in this one, is I like to try to figure out what is going on from a cold record. The less I have to rely on other people telling me this and that, the better off I am. One of the reasons that Edward Gibbon wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and the reason that book will never be surpassed as a history of Rome, is that he worked from primary sources. And he relied on himself, and he relied on these documents. The documents don't really lie. Everything you really need is in the documents. And what I've discovered as I made this last film, which I'm calling All of Plenary's Men, is that those are the primary sources. That's where you want to be. The more you can rely on primary sources, and the less you rely on testimony, unless it's from people who were inside somewhere and you just have no other access to information, you're better off going with the documents.
And they'll be happy to tell you the crimes that they're committing. They're happy to share that. We're committing crimes. This is what they look like. This is when they occurred. This is when they will occur in the future. And these are going to be our profits. So I hope you don't mind. But this is, like you said, it's there. I mean, that's part of their code, is to tell people what they're doing. And they do. They'll tell you flat out.
More and more, that's the case. I mean, it's only been since December of 2012 that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, came out and said, we look at collateral consequences when we're discussing a prosecution, which means that people can commit crimes with impunity because the whole wide world would collapse if we indicted a bank, which is a completely ridiculous reason for any number of reasons. The first of which is collateral consequences isn't law. That whole notion appears in the attorney's manual, which is a guideline. That's not law. You're not getting. In fact, the Federal Reserve itself tried that argument. Do you remember Mark Pittman of Bloomberg, and he had that Freedom of Information Act case about the bailouts, and he wanted the information. He said, the Fed, who are you lending the money to? And they wouldn't tell him. So he filed a Freedom of Information Act request, and he ended up in a lawsuit. Okay, and he won. Mark Pittman of Bloomberg beat the Fed at their own game. He beat him in court, and they had to turn over the documents. And that's how we know how much money the Fed was lending out in the immediate aftermath of the bailouts. But in any event, when that case was being argued, the Federal Reserve tried to make the argument that if we disclose this information, all this bad stuff's going to happen. And the court, the district court in the Southern District of New York rejected it. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals rejected that argument. That argument is it's invalid. You can't make an argument in court based on what you think might happen. You kind of can. You have these expert witnesses, but whatever. The court called them on it, and said no. So what do? They do an end around with the attorney's manual and say, well, we're not going to prosecute at all because Chicken Little here tells us that the sky would fall if we indicted a bank, right? So they don't get indicted. It just, the rule of law is just a bad joke in the U.S. now. And it's really sad because it's really the rule of law and it's really transparency and it's a level playing field for everybody that made the country great. And now we don't have that. Now we've got a system of what I call a Rolodex system where it's not what you know or how good you are, it's who you know. And if you know somebody high up, you're going to be fine. And if you don't, it doesn't matter how good you are, you're not connected, and that's that. And you see that everywhere. Across every industry, these people at the top are just unworthy.
I don't know what the answer is, except to either start over or get out. I mean, in all honesty.
Well, I think it's either revolution or revolution.
I said back in, 2003, after I'd been, indoctrinated to the quote unquote dark side in early 2001. And I came to the conclusion, I was like, this system needs to be completely burned down to the ground. You got to move the country's capital as far away from the East Coast as possible, far away from either coast as possible, and take the original 10 Bill of Rights and rebuild the government and rebuild the system. That's the only way, which is essentially the only way that'll happen is a revolution.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people will tell you, well, we need to pass this law, we need to pass that law. And my answer to that is, are you insane? The laws we have now aren't enforced. Don't you get it?
Right.
Laws that are selectively enforced aren't laws at all. They're just a tool of oppression.
They're tools of oppression. I mean, and there are plenty of laws for you and I. Let's be clear about that. Yeah. All the laws that are on the books are there for you and I. They're not there for the ruling class. They're not there for the banking class, period.
No, you can tell, as far as I'm concerned, every law that's been passed since 2007 is just a way to prop up the big banks and the big players in every industry in a way to suppress competition because the law is selectively enforced, period. Basically, and the selectively enforced law, again, gets back to, well, there's a sovereign who's selectively enforcing, who's deciding who to enforce a law against and who's above the law. Who's making that decision? Someone is. And whoever's making that decision is your true sovereign. And that sovereign is not in the U.S. government. So don't pass any more laws.
John, we certainly appreciate all your time today. And we've been speaking with John Titus of Best Evidence.
John, really appreciate your time. And I know it takes a lot of work to get these films and videos finished. And I think, at least I'm speaking for myself, I can't wait to see the whole thing.
Well, thanks for having me on again, fellas. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And we will talk with you soon.
Thanks, Rory.